Utah last week lost out on Jerome Miles. The talented five-star receiver who resides in the state of Utah is going to USC to play for Lincoln Riley. What does this mean for Utah recruiting? Also, time to preview the Wildcats. What challenges could they prevent to Kyle Whittingham and company? That's what we're talking about on today's Locked On Utes.
You are Locked On Utes, your daily podcast on the Utah Utes. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for making Locked On Utes your first listen of the day. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network. If you're in the market for a second listen, Locked On College Football and Locked On Big 12 have you covered. This is your first time checking out our show. Make sure you like and subscribe. Love interacting with all of you in the YouTube comments. Those all on social media where you can follow our show at Locked On Utes on X. Today's episode of Locked On Utes is brought to you by FanDuel. You can place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. You can visit FanDuel.com to get started today. My name is JT Wistrcill, former intern inside the University of Utah Athletic Department. And on today's show, I have a fun couple topics that I want to talk with you guys all about. First of which is going to be Jerome Miles talking about why he chose USC over Utah and what it means for Utah recruiting. Is it just a negative sign? Is it a negative sign or is it a one-time negative thing that Utah just like any recruit, lost out on? Obviously stings more because it's a five-star. We're going to break down the significance of that. Then Austin Eames is going to be joining me to preview Arizona. And then we also get to talk about our most pleasant, or I'll say biggest surprises on the season so far. That's what's coming up on Locked On Utes.
Last week, we were so busy getting ready for the Oklahoma State game, we didn't really get a chance to talk about that Jerome Miles is not going to be a Utah Ute. He committed to USC. It came down to Utah, Texas A&M, and the Trojans, and he went with the Trojans. And look, this was a five-star receiver. Utah could have landed him. That would have been an absolute game changer. And look, I understand why people are upset that Utah wasn't able to close the deal on Miles, but at the end of the day, Jerome Miles was always going to be a luxury for this Utah team to land. I don't think there are people out there who are like, oh, this is such a bad sign for Utah's recruiting and the things of that nature. Utah's never landed a receiver like this, and they've had success. So adding Miles would have been an awesome luxury. But to then think they didn't land him and to look at it from like, oh, man, this is a horrible trend of what's to come. I don't ever really overreact to recruiting like that, especially at a position that Utah has always been good with having solid players at, never the best. Miles would have been an awesome get for Utah, but the sky is not falling for Utah football recruiting, even though they let one of the best receivers to ever play in the state not stay in state. So Moose, that's how I feel about Miles choosing USC over Utah. How do you read the situation?
You know what? I was honestly pretty devastated with the decision. I thought he'd go towards USC, and it's just a gosh darn shame because he was going to be a hometown hero. Honestly, the NIL for both teams was really comparable.
Really?
That was what's interesting. Utah wanted him more than you could possibly know. And he was looking at USC and he's like, I wouldn't make as much money in California because of the state taxes. And I'm like, that is crazy that is coming into play with NIL and everything that's going on, because it used to just be side-by-side comparison because all scholarships were created equally, basically. But with Jerome, I think what really pushed him is like, let's look at the top receivers to come out of the University of Utah. Right now, we've got Britton Covey. We've got Tim Patrick. We've got
Devon Bailey, still drafted.
Yeah, Devon Bailey. And you know what? Those are great receivers. Don't get me wrong.
And I should say, because before someone drops in the comments, we know Steve Smith. We're talking in the modern era.
Yeah, in the last 5 years, let's call it that. The problem is USC, they put receivers in and year out, and they have a proven track record. It doesn't matter who the head coach is. It doesn't matter who the offensive coordinator is. What matters, it doesn't even matter who the quarterback is. They're going to give you an opportunity to play in the NFL. And I think Jerome really wanted to spread his wings. But best case scenario for Utah is not get offended with the hat pick, the little hat trick he did. He's a 17-year-old kid. Get over it. It's fine.
Agreed.
With him, I mean, kids do dumb things. He's a kid. It's fine. He's a freak athlete of a kid, but the best case for Utah was he probably gets homesick. He pulls a Puka Nakua or a Jackson Dart where they decide to enter the portal, which could happen just like that. So Utah, don't give up on this kid. If he never comes to Utah, it's okay. He's still been in our state. He's still given a ton of blood, sweat, and tears. And he'll be repping this state whether he likes it or not. And the thing is, I could see him pulling a Puka Nacua, showing up at Utah, and still being the most prolific receiver ever to don on that drum and feather on the helmet.
I thought there was a chance Utah could land him just for the fact of your odds of contributing at Utah in year one are significantly higher than USC, but it's hard to argue with choosing Lincoln Riley's offense over Andy Ludwig's offense or whatever form of offense Utah runs. No matter when Kyle Whittingham retires, I still believe that Morgan Scalley is going to want this to be a run-first team, even as Utah becomes more explosive. And look, even when Miles was talking, right, he talked about one of the reasons he committed there was he said all three develop NFL talent at high level and they have good coaching. But USC, they have the most NFL draft picks ever other than Notre Dame. And especially at the receiver position, we talked about the last 5 years, Drake London, Jordan Addison, those were first round type of receivers. And that's without even mentioning a Amon-Ra St. Brown. You look at a guy like Juju Smith-Schuster, all of who have gone on to have long NFL careers or just were very high picks. So hard to argue with choosing USC because they have a much better track record for utilizing their receivers than Utah does. So that's where I understand it. And even his quotes, right? He mentioned, hey, like just the QB pedigree that USC has, knowing they're going to air it out more. That's why I also don't, I just don't feel like this is the bad miss for Utah. And there are still they have Tayshawn Lyons still. They had David Washington. There are other receivers that are going to contribute on this team. I don't think they're Jerome Miles, but I think they're going to Utah can still get quality production out of them. And despite Utah's passing game, not like we have Damian Alford hasn't done anything this year, unfortunately. There is value in being number one receiver at the University of Utah. Devon Bailey experienced it. Britton Covey got to experience it a little bit, right? We've seen Dorian Singer start to experience it just in the Oklahoma State game. So I still believe this Utah team is going to be able to land quality receivers in the transfer portal.
Yeah, I agree as well. And the thing is with Utah, they really like some 12 personnel, some 13 personnel. They like going big on big. When you start going 12 or 13 in personnel, meaning there's 2 or 3 tight ends on the field, or 22, 2 running backs, and 2 tight ends, that means there's only 1 receiver on the field. So when I look at like a Semi Fehoko, who had Utah in his top plays, and then he went to Stanford, and you're like, okay, why'd you go to Stanford? Because they do the same thing Utah does, and they're in 13 personnel. He'd only get on the field 60% of the time because you have 1 receiver coming in and out. And so if I'm sitting there and I'm Jerome Miles and I'm like, USC's running 10 personnel, that means I have 4 different positions that I could go on the field like that. And that's their base personnel. Maybe they're at 11 personnel, maybe a tight end's on the field. And then you're like, okay, I have an opportunity to play as a freshman, go in and start. Not that he didn't have that opportunity at Utah, but he also is playing in the Big Ten, which is a little more competitive, a little more eyeballs. And the flight from LA to Utah is fairly cheap that he can do all the time.
It is fairly cheap. And most fascinating thing I think we mentioned was what you talked about with the NIL money. I find that very interesting. And I didn't even think about the tax implications of living in California. He also mentioned just the lifestyle in California being something as well. I can understand the allure of the oceans and all of that too. But hey, I know for me personally, I've always been a mountains over beach guy anyway. So I'll stick with Utah there. But I understand what he's saying. And I also love what you mentioned, Moose. You never know. 17-year-old kid might not love it at USC and could end up coming back to this Utah squad because he did rave about the coaching staff, even in his commitment, saying he thought all 3 had really strong coaching. So we'll see how the commitment plays out. But now we got to focus to the present. Let's talk about this Utah team as they gear up for Arizona. Moose, thanks for stopping by again.
No problem. Have a great one, JT.
Today's episode of Locked On Utes is brought to you by Roy. Roy is a new platform that lets fans make contributions directly to their favorite athletes. You can download Roy from iOS or Android and enter the referral code Locked On. That's capital Locked and On, but a space in between them, all the letters capitalized, and you'll automatically be entered into a sweepstake to win $5,000 cash. No purchase necessary, void where prohibited. This week, the best player for Utah's roster has to be Micah Bernard, because Micah Bernard was just a man on a mission down in Stillwater. So Micah Bernard was showing out. So I'm going to give Micah $100 on Roy. If you were impressed as much as I was with his performance, you can show him some love too. Just hop on Roy and throw in a few bucks. If everyone pitches in just $10, it adds up fast for Micah Bernard. Now you have the chance to show your appreciation for Micah Bernard after his standout performance this week, as well as what he'll continue to do and bring this program more success. Get off the sidelines and get into the NIL game with Roy. Support the players, change the game with Roy today. Also want to take a moment to talk to you about another sponsor of our episode of Locked On Utes today. It's our friends at LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to find quality professionals that are right for the role. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help you find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. They help you hire professionals you can't find anywhere else, even those who aren't actively searching for a new job but might be open to the perfect role in a given month. Over 70% of LinkedIn users don't visit other leading job sites. So if you're not looking on LinkedIn, you're looking in the wrong place. On LinkedIn, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. You can hire professionals like a professional on LinkedIn. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make that process easier. They even just launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process that much faster. 2.5 million small businesses use LinkedIn for hiring. And if you want to join that number, you can post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That's all caps, no spaces, linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. All right, now excited to be joined by Austin Eames to preview the Arizona Wildcats coming into Salt Lake City to face off against Utah. And starting out with this matchup, Austin, I'm just going to be plain and say it. This was not what I expected this matchup to look like coming into the season. I thought that Arizona would still be ranked. Yes, I thought there was definitely I thought they would lose to Kansas State, but I thought they'd be much more competitive. And also their previous games, I thought they just looked better. They did not look great against New Mexico State. They actually trailed, or against New Mexico. They actually were only up by 3 at half against Northern Arizona. Shout out Big Sky, but they were down at halftime to the Lumberjacks, a Big Sky school. And then they got their doors blown off by a physical Kansas State team. Utah plays a physical brand of football. We can break down a little bit more why in a moment, but originally I thought this was going to be a game where I'm like, okay, tough to beat Utah at home, but Arizona will have a chance to. I feel like the chances of an upset have significantly gone down based on what we've seen from the Wildcats in 2024.
Yeah, the Arizona that Utah's going to play this weekend at Wistrcill Stadium is a lot different than the one they faced in Tucson during the 2023 season. I mean, obviously, the departure of Jed Fish is a big reason why. Took a bunch of players, including Jonah Coleman, the running back, the prolific running back from Arizona last season with him to Washington. But Brett Brennan's group, I think we all thought they were going to be better coming into the season. And then that Kansas State game last week, they did not look very good. Avery Johnson ran all over them. 2-1, not ranked anymore. So it's definitely going to be interesting to see what happens in Wistrcill this weekend. Obviously, it's a night game. Utah loves their night games. I think all the students, all the fans are happy that the night games are back. But it's going to be a tough task for Arizona to come into Wistrcill Stadium and take on Utah, who obviously is coming off a big win with their backup quarterback against Oklahoma State.
Utah's coming off a monumental win. Arizona coming off a bye. But what happened against Kansas State? Got their doors blown off. They scored the first drive of the game, and the game ended 31-7. Noah Fafita had a red zone interception that hurt the Wildcats, but overall, they just couldn't sustain drives. They would move the ball a little bit. They had over 300 yards of total offense, but they couldn't make the plays that they needed to make to move the chains routinely and get those key first downs, while they let, like you mentioned, Avery Johnson have a lot of success with his legs against them. When you're talking about this Arizona team, it starts with Noah Fafita and Tora McMillan, but it could also end with Fafita and McMillan, because those are by far the two best things they have going. But McMillan has over 400 yards receiving. No one else on Arizona has over 100. And yes, they didn't play last week, but we're still 3 games into the season and they haven't shown enough progress there, right? So they're good quarterback, good receiver. Run game is not, the offensive line and running backs, not great. Leave a lot to be desired there. I do not expect the Wildcats. They ran for under 60 yards against Kansas State. I do not expect that to change against Utah. And they're finally going to figure it out in Rice-Eccles Stadium, facing one of the best run defenses in the entire Big 12. And then if you look at their defense, look, I think the secondary has some solid players there, but factor in a little bit of a revenge element for Dorian Singer. Shouldn't say revenge. I think he left things on a good terms there. It's just he had a good opportunity to go to USC and took it. You always want to play well against your former team, but their front seven is not strong. Kansas State themselves, they ran for over 250 yards, I believe. It was definitely over 225, but I think it was over 250 yards against this Arizona team. So when you look at how Kansas State beat them, I think Utah's just a better version of Kansas State. So it's not a good matchup for the Wildcats.
Yeah, I agree. You said earlier it could start and it could end with Noah Fifita and Tataroa McMillan, and I totally agree. Obviously, McMillan did a little bit of stat padding with that first game against New Mexico, went for over 300 yards receiving, but he's a really good wide receiver. I might argue that he's the best wide receiver in college football. I think you could definitely say top 3 with Travis Hunter also up there. It's going to be a first-round draft pick, and he's amazing. So I think Utah's really going to have their work cut out for him there. He's definitely a guy that you just need to contain. He's going to get his receptions. He's going to have big plays, but you just need to contain him. I think Zamiah Vaughn will definitely have his work cut out for him. But I wouldn't be surprised if Utah goes and doubles McMillan quite a bit because he really is the heart and soul of that team's offense. He has 33 targets this season. The next closest receiver on Arizona has 10. The next after that is their running back with 9. So McMillan is the centerpiece of that offense. They do everything through him. And yeah, I think if Utah can stop him, they can really go far. Fifita and McMillan, they have a connection. And sometimes even Fifita can get into a lot of trouble when he just throws it down to McMillan. I've seen a couple times this season where things aren't working out, the play's breaking down, and he just throws it up to McMillan. And McMillan is a great contested catch receiver, probably, again, the best in college football. But if you have 1 or even 2 cornerbacks in coverage expecting it, they can get an interception. And I've seen Fifita throw interceptions. We've seen Fifita throw interceptions that way this year. So I think Utah will also see that, and I'm really hoping that defense can get some good turnovers and run away with the game.
I agree. I think that it's really is. I would double McMillan. He's one of the best receivers in college football. I don't know why you would want him one-on-one with Zamiah Vaughn. Is a really good corner. I think he's one of the best in the Big 12. Elijah Davis, Smith Stone, Cameron Calhoun, whoever it is. I think Utah is a really good secondary. But McMillan is, as you mentioned, one of the 10 best receivers. And when they don't have other guys who are going to beat you, I'm having Gilman just hang over top wherever he goes. So it's always a double team for Utah on McMillan. Then as you're looking at Fifita, he's a talented player, but just get pressure on him. This is an offensive line that did not look great a couple weeks ago against Kansas State. So I do think you can get pressure on him. I think you can make them one-dimensional and playing inside Rice-Eccles Stadium as a visiting team do not go together as a recipe for success. Yeah. So that's where I do think Utah's going to have that success. And we already said Utah should run the ball very effectively. Micah Bernard has been fantastic for this season for Utah, and I do think Wilson will have the opportunity to make plays for his legs, like you highlighted with Avery Johnson having that success there. Wilson gets more and more comfortable each week, and yes, I said Isaac Wilson. I am going to continue to operate at this point under the assumption that Isaac Wilson will be Utah's starter until we actually see Cam Rising back out on the field again, even after the bye week. I just don't think we can make that assumption based on what happened last year, and especially after what happened last week when we felt so good he was going to play. But even with Isaac Wilson in the game, Utah is going to be a strong favorite in this game. As you know, you look at the FanDuel odds, Utah is favored in this one, Austin, by 11.5. And as we're sitting here right now recording this, I do think Utah is going to win by over 12 points.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you look back at the history of this matchup, and most of the contests in the last 10 years have been decided by 2 or more scores. I mean, these games are usually very skewed in one direction. Obviously, we saw that last year. I think Arizona gave Utah plenty of bulletin board material. You talk about 40 seconds left in the game. Jaden DeLora throws up a 51-yard touchdown to McMillan when they could have easily kneeled it out and taken the 35-18 victory. They didn't. And I think this Utah team remembers that. I think they have it on their bulletin board, as I said, and I think they're not going to let Arizona get away with an easy game this time around. But yeah, that Arizona defense definitely leaves a lot to be desired. You talk about being bad against the run. They're number 97 in the country, allowing 173 yards per game rushing. Obviously, a big portion of that is from quarterbacks. New Mexico's quarterback had 130 yards rushing. That was a career high for him. Avery Johnson had 110 yards rushing. That was a career high for him. So this team is not good at stopping the run. And what has Utah done exceptionally well the last couple of weeks? That's run the ball. So Micah Bernard, I think, is going to feast. I can't wait to see that. And yeah, this Arizona defense, I think, is just going to get torched. I mean, Dorian Singer looked phenomenal last game against Oklahoma State. He's a guy that's really coming into his own, and I think is benefiting from Isaac Wilson a little bit. And I'm really excited. Obviously, Arizona also has Tacario Davis. I think we can't talk about their defense without mentioning his name. He's a guy that could be a first-round talent, but maybe isn't performing as people thought he would this year. But Jacob Manu, Tay Brown as linebackers. It's definitely going to be interesting to see how Utah handles this Arizona defense.
It will be incredibly fascinating, and I can't wait for it to play out on Saturday. Austin, we're now 4 games into the season. So before we get out of here today, I want to talk about what's been the biggest surprise that each of us believe for Utah football in 2024. That's what we're going to be discussing in one moment. Today's episode of Locked On Utes is brought to you by FanDuel. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. That's at FanDuel.com. Speaking of FanDuel, with that NFL action, how about the Thursday night game this week? Cowboys really need a win, taking on the Giants. I'm not a Danny Dimes guy, so you can head over to FanDuel and check that one out. How about also Baltimore Ravens and Bills, 2 of the top contenders in the AFC outside the Chiefs, of course. And if we're going back to college football, mention that line, Utah favored by 11.5 at the moment against Arizona. I think it's a bad matchup for the Wildcats. So if you feel the same way as me, you can head over to FanDuel today. And there are so many great college football games as well as the MLB playoffs now getting underway as well. FanDuel is the place to be for your sports betting needs. FanDuel, America's #1 sports book. All right, Austin, as we wind this one down, I want to know for you, what has been the most pleasant / biggest surprise about this Utah football team for you this fall so far?
Yeah, I think for me, the most pleasant surprise so far through 4 games of the season, obviously 4-0, Utah's looking amazing, is the offensive line. For me, that was one of the position groups that definitely had a question mark next to it entering the season. Obviously, you felt really good about the quarterback room with Cam Rising coming back healthy. Felt really good about tight ends with Brant Kuithe again coming back and being healthy. Obviously, you have other guys in that room that are also really talented. Same thing goes for the wide receiver room. But you talk about the offensive line. They lost 3 starters, 2 to the draft and 1 transfer. So there was positions that needed to get filled. Even then, Spencer Fano, one of the returners, is young, and he was an All-American as a freshman, but he's still young. Michael Mokafisi also came back at right guard, but he only had 2 returners, and I was really interested to see who, for one, Utah was going to get to fill the 3 positions that they needed to fill on the offensive line. But so far, it looks like they filled them well because, man, this offensive line is doing phenomenal, and they're really doing their thing. They're locking it down. Obviously, Micah has 3 games of over 100 yards rushing. This Utah team is averaging 206.3 yards of rushing a game. Has only given up 6 sacks through the first 4 games. That's with a redshirt freshman, Caleb Lomu, on the left side. Spencer Fano moved to the right side. But yeah, I love this offensive line, especially, like I said, the right side, right tackle and right guard, Fano and Mokafisi. I mean, Utah ran for 140 yards on 17 carries last week against Oklahoma State. I saw a statistic that they averaged 5.3 yards to the B gap, 9.6 yards per carry through the C gap. And that's outside the tackle against Oklahoma State. So, I mean, when Utah's running to the right, they're getting plenty of yards. And I think that is just propelling them forward. And it's really making it easy on Isaac Wilson to command the game, command the clock, do what he needs to do and play action and open up big passes downfield, which is exactly what a freshman quarterback needs. Obviously, they're protecting him well. So I'm really happy with this offensive line. I like that it has youth. It has guys that are going to come back next season and just get better, keep developing. And I'm also glad that we have guys that could potentially be NFL draft candidates. And yeah, the offensive line is just doing great. I can't speak highly enough about them, and I'm really excited to see what they do against Arizona State because, as we talked about, that defensive line is really nothing to write home about. So I think the Utah offensive line should continue to do a really good job.
Been really impressive to watch their improvement each week. Going into this season, the offensive line's play is not my biggest surprise. It was my biggest question going into the season. But if you go back and watch what I said about the offensive line always, for those of you listening saying, JT, you were a doubter on the offensive line. No. Said it was my biggest question mark, but thought they would do well. Now, they already had a schedule with the way they dominated the front against Oklahoma State? Yes. I mean, Steve Bartle of KSL Sports tweeted out that PFF released their top 5 graded offensive players. 3 of the top 5 are offensive linemen. Spencer Fano, Keithy, Tongai, and Lomu. That's incredible. That's what this group has been able to do, especially those young tackles in Fano who got the experience, but still making the change to the right side. And then as well, you talk about Lomu and even Tongai's getting settled in at guard. So really impressed with this offensive line. Shout out to Jim Harding. And they put in work last week. And because they've put in work, that's led to my biggest surprise of the season taking shape. That's Micah Bernard. I thought Micah Bernard was the best running back on this Utah team. I thought Micah Bernard would have a very good year. I did not think through 4 games into the season, Micah Bernard would be one more 100-yard rushing game away from surpassing the most yards he's ever had in a single season as a Utah running back. I did not think Micah Bernard would be 6th in the country in rushing yards with 456. Jaquindon Jackson's 4th, by the way. So that 2022 Utah backfield late in the season looking pretty nice. Micah Bernard is the most yards amongst all Big 12 backs currently, rushing yards. His 6.9 yards per carry among the top 10 running backs in yards nationally ranks 4th in college football. And as I mentioned, the most rushing yards he's ever had in a season were 533 and 523 in 22 and then 21. So he's less than 100 yards away from passing both of those marks. Coming into the year, he had 2 games on his career over 100 yards rushing, with both those happening back in 2021. Now he has had 3 consecutive games over 100 yards rushing. And if we include a little caveat, he should have even more yards because against Southern Utah, he had like 5 carries for 33 yards. So even if they had given him the ball more that game, obviously the number would be even higher. If you factor in Utah appearing in the Big 12 championship game, I'm willing to factor that in, as well as their game in the college football playoff. If they win said Big 12 championship game, heck, even there's a bowl team, obviously, so they're going to be involved in some point of play. Micah Bernard is on pace for over 2,000 rushing yards this season. I did not expect that out of Micah Bernard. That has been my biggest surprise of the season so far.
Yeah, that's a good one, JT. But I love that Micah Bernard is just having so much success with his Utah team. I mean, you talk about a guy that he played corner against Ohio State in the Rose Bowl, and then was obviously injured in 2023. But to come to Utah's backfield this year, take a commanding lead in that running back room that in preseason we had no idea who was going to be the leading rusher. Come to the season, it could have been Jalen Glover, it could have been anybody, but Micah has taken hold of that room, and yeah, he's performed. He's averaging over 6 yards a carry. Obviously, you said is a top 10 rusher in the country in terms of yards. I'm also just so glad that Jaquindon Jackson's up there. It's cool to see that Utah running backs are having a ton of success. But yeah, Micah's doing amazing. It was great to see him have over 180 yards against Oklahoma State. And I mean, it goes back to that offensive line play. They're making things easy for him. Obviously, he's a very gifted athlete, and he's doing amazing things for the team. But with that offensive line, I mean, wow, I think this Utah rushing attack is something to be reckoned with.
The fact that we were able to talk about our biggest surprises both correlating, I think just is such an encouraging sign of how well balanced this Utah offense is looking to be. The ground game is still the focal point, but when you look at what Brankethy and Dorian Singer were able to do last week, Isaac Wilson continue to develop and come along. It's a very encouraging sign about the progress that this Utah squad has made, and they got another opportunity to show that progress this Saturday against Arizona. Austin, always great having you on, my friend. Thank you.
Oh, of course, JT.
Make sure you guys give Austin a follow at Austin Eames 55 on X. That's going to do it for today's edition of Locked On Utes. On tomorrow's show, PFF's Max Chadwick stops by to do a preview even more in depth on what Arizona will look to do. We're going to dive deeper into the offensive and defensive side of the ball, as well as I got a little bit of an undefeated Utah potential take. I know some of you earlier in the week didn't like that I posed that. I'm going to double down a little bit on tomorrow's show. Make sure you guys check it out then. That's going to do it for today's edition of Locked On Utes. We'll see you tomorrow.